Joe Stretch is 32, single, and runs his own business. He's been visiting Ursula, his step-grandmother, to help her after she broke her hip. Ursula lives a hermit-like existence in a large, decaying old house. Her pretty next-door neighbour, Lottie, married to a rich fund manager, has also taken an interest in Ursula, and Joe and she have had an affair. He has recently ended it and started to live with his cousin Evie. A couple of weeks later, Joe went out to see Ursula. He wanted to check on the evening carer, if he could catch her there. Ursula was still complaining about what it all cost, and he had to convince her it was sensible. As he drove down the A3, he remembered the first time he'd been summoned to Coombe Hill, and how things had changed since. Compared to then, he'd made some real decisions, moved forward. He'd managed Ursula, contrary to his first instincts. He'd been through an affair, fallen in love, and now at the office he'd bought some time, a bit of space to hold on. Perhaps he was going to begin a family life. It wasn't so strange now as an idea. He could look his sisters in the eye. Their children would have another cousin. He turned off Coombe Lane, and in spite of all he'd done at the house, he still had the same moment's irritation. What would he find? What additional work would have to be done? Who would have to be contacted? In the past he could temper it with the promise of Lottie. Now he had to face Ursula on his own with no diversions. He parked, went round to the side door and knocked. She hadn't pulled the curtains, he could see inside. He was appalled to see Lottie was sitting with Ursula at the table. He hesitated a moment. How could he deal with her? Perhaps he should come back later. But he was there. He would have to get on with it. He tried the back door. It was unlocked. He went in, calling out as he walked into the passage. Lottie looked haggard and pale. Her hair, which was usually so clean and flowing, hung down untidily and looked unwashed. She barely smiled at him. "There you are," said Ursula. "You can tell him yourself. Mrs. Woodley's leaving tomorrow." "Is that true? That's sudden." "Bit of a shock," Joe said. He went over to Ursula and kissed her lightly on the cheek. Then he sat down opposite Lottie. He wondered if she'd been drinking again. She spoke slowly and sadly. "Yes, we are. It's been terrible. Kit's business is in serious trouble. He's had to close the fund. You know that most of the investors tried to withdraw their money, but it wasn't easy to pay them out. I discovered that he'd mortgaged our houses to a bank to raise more capital. Now the bank wants it all back. They've foreclosed on everything. They want possession now while they think they can still sell. We've got to go. The housekeeper and the nanny have gone. The children are coming out of school. Kit's rented a house in Reigate. Do you know where that is? It's near Gatwick. It's all right. It's not Coombe Hill, not London, not what we're used to. The house is much smaller. We can manage, but it's hard adjusting. We've lost face. I feel miserable most of the time. And I get angry. I don't know who with. Kit for borrowing, the bankers, myself for not noticing, the city. She became tearful. Ursula said, "She's come to say goodbye. It's lucky you came." He said, "That's bad news. I'm really sorry for you both. But you'll manage, surely. I can't see you failing ever." "Can't you?" Lottie said with a sudden flare-up. Under the table, She tried to find his foot. He thought he could now smell drink. It was a difficult moment. But then she stood up wearily and leaned forward, both hands on the table. "I've been packing up the last week. It's so hard. There's too much stuff for the new place. The kids cry every night. So do I." Ursula said, "Mrs. Woodley, I'll miss you. You were very good to me as a neighbour. I don't know what I shall do without you." He said with vigour, "Granny, it's Mrs. Hadley Wood. I've told you before." Lottie said, "It doesn't matter. At least you got Joe, Mrs. Ironmonger. When he chooses. He's trying to drop me, you know. Anyway, there's plenty for him to do in the other room, bills and things. Can't get my head round it all. These carers charge the earth, and one of them came earlier and did nothing much, and I signed for it." "You missed her," she said, accusingly, nodding towards Joe. Ursula struggled to her feet and looked round for a stick. It was hanging on the back of her chair. She leaned on the arm, found it, and then shuffled round the table towards Lottie. "Look, my dear, you've had a shock, I know. My life has gone through sunny times and then big storms and knocked you down. I was all right in here with you next door, and then I fell out of bed. And now look at me, when I'm 80-something. 7, is it, Joe? Just get on with it, and make the best of what you got. I did." "Is this the best, Granny?" said Joe suddenly. "Take heart, fair days will shine. Where does that come from?" Ursula said. "Gus used to sing it. I'll remember in a day or two. Have you left your address? Cancelled your milk? Oh, dear, I'm going to miss you, Lottie. That is you, isn't it? Come back and see me. I've been on the mend, they say. But things aren't what they used to be." Lottie managed a weak smile and kissed Ursula on the cheek. "Now the other one," Ursula said. "That's how they do it over there, and then once more, 3 times." Joe stood up and came round to Lottie. He tried to be nice to her in front of Ursula. He said, "It's a shocking way to have to go. You've been wonderful to Ursula. You've made all the difference." He hoped he struck the right note. "While it lasted, I felt the same." She looked straight at him. Now he knew there was alcohol. "But you couldn't keep going, could you, Joe? Didn't live up to expectations." Ursula didn't appear to hear that. Lottie left, and Ursula went back unsteadily to her chair. "When you're young, you can have what you want when you want it. That's what it seemed like," Ursula said. "Now I'm old, the body doesn't keep up with my mind. It's painful with all the memories, dealing with them, stalking through my mind, knowing I can't have things back again. I can't hear, can't move, can't see properly. Now life's about eating. I'm wondering if I can get to sleep, and if I do, whether I'll stay asleep. They've offered me a sleeping pill with the drugs they've given me, but I said no." "You've done very well." "Did you say go to hell?" "No," he shouted. "I said you've done very well. That's because I've stayed where I belong." He settled her down, with the television switched on and her headphones to hand. He went out across the hall, now brightly lit, and into the front room, and sat down at Ursula's desk to go through the posted bills. But as he looked at the pile of papers, he thought about Lottie and Kit. He didn't feel guilty about them. Kit was a speculator, and Lottie wanted a bit of excitement. He could move on now. All the same, it was hard for the Hadley Woods, a lifestyle collapsing like the opening blitz of a long war. On the desk there was a heap of envelopes, some torn open, some untouched. He set to. It was laborious checking the invoices and putting them in the right places, and seeing to the checks which were necessary. He'd already discovered that now she was recovered, Ursula was quite up to doing it, but she liked him to do it. She wouldn't use direct debits or standing orders, so it was manual payment every time. He'd been there half an hour when there was a hurried tapping at the window. He lifted the curtain. It was Lottie, pointing in the direction of the front door. He didn't want to have a scene. He didn't want to see her again. He was embarrassed, wanted to forget her. But he couldn't leave her out there. She might make a fuss like before at his flat. He went to let her in, and as she passed him, he smelled the drink more strongly. They went into the front room. He closed the door behind them. She said, "I couldn't bear it, seeing you knowing." "Knowing what?" "Everything we did in this house. We had such good times. Remember the cellar? That's when I knew about you." She seemed overwrought, nervously excited, not able to keep still. "Don't you want to remember everything we did? How you felt me? How I showed you? Let you in? Don't you want to see it again?" Now she was tugging him towards her. "This is the last time. You can have it once more, just once. I can have it again. Kiss me, Joe." She reached up and tried to pull his head to her face and find his mouth. He pushed her off. He said, "You've been drinking. That's enough. You know how it is." "Of course I remember. How could I forget? But I'm sorry it's over. I've moved on." "Joe, darling, what about a bit of gallantry? A bit of nostalgia? Something for the road, the last waltz? Can't you get it up now?" She went for his trousers and tried to pull them down, goosed him. He backed away, bumping into the sheeted furniture. "For God's sake, leave off, will you?" "You're a wanker," she said. She was unsteady. "You're drunk," he said firmly. "You'd better go home." "One last thing I want to do." She lifted her hand as he started to protest. "No, it's all right. This is for me. I promise I'll be quiet." She went over to the door and opened it slowly and stood there listening. There was no sound from beyond the green baize door on the other side. She went out into the hall. "What's the matter?" he whispered loudly. "Where are you going?" "Stay there and watch," she said quietly. He walked to the staircase up the side of the hall. Between the ornate lamps, standing guard at the foot. Holding on to the wide banister, she slowly climbed to the top, past the pictures, and disappeared round the corner. Joe hesitated. He had no idea where this was leading. He didn't know if he should go up or not. He went over to the staircase and slowly climbed the first treads to the turn, and then stood there waiting. A door slammed somewhere upstairs. Then Lottie appeared. She was wearing Ursula's long lame dress. It fitted her perfectly. She looked stunning, a period manner, needing only a cigarette in a long holder and boa to set her off. Now she was imitating the theatrical gestures. She walked slowly along the gallery overlooking the hall, swaying as if to a dance. She stopped halfway along, turned to look down, and stood still, statuesque in the new lighting. "Look at me. Remember me." She lifted both her arms and fiddled at the back of her dress for a moment, and then it slipped off her. She was naked. Joe was transfixed. She was perfect, just as he had had her all those times. It pricked him. Still he stayed motionless. Now she was shouting, "Look at me! I'm yours! Come and get me! Come on!" Again she swayed slightly. "Remember it? I'm your mistress, your lover. Always was and will be." Just for a second, a few seconds, he was ready to run up and go for her. She turned him on. He could have her one more time and be done with it. As this desire ran through him, there was a sudden noise. He looked away across the hall. Ursula was standing in the doorway, leaning on her stick. He had forgotten to lock the door. Now she slowly advanced across the dull parquet. Halfway she stopped. She looked up at Lottie on the gallery, who was standing there looking down, not moving. Joe didn't know what to do. He could see that Ursula was shaking. She could barely keep standing, leaning heavily on her stick. I understand it all now," she said slowly. "You didn't come to see me, Joe. You came to see her." And she nodded upwards. "She looks like a whore. She is a whore. What about your husband and children, Mrs. Woodhadley? Look at you, all body and no sense. And as for you, Joe, I was your midwife, saw you into the world when others would have cast you out, kept Gus away from you and your mother." Ursula shuffled towards him and paused. "Well, now I know. You're just like the others, in things for what you can get. I thought, for a little while I thought, that you actually cared about me, that you didn't want to let me fade away alone, that you liked me. Let me tell you, silly boy, I was going to honour you, make a difference to you. Not now. You can make your bed with her up there." She gave a bit nearer. "I tell you, I'm going to make another—" But as she was speaking, she gave a great gasp, picked up her stick as if to wave it at Joe, fell heavily towards him, and as she fell, her head struck the bottom tread of the staircase under the ornamental light. She didn't move. He looked down at her, horrified. Lottie screamed. He went over to Ursula and gingerly bent over her to see if there was any movement. Then he straightened up and remembered Lottie still standing on the gallery above, still naked. He shouted up at her, "Go and get dressed. Put the dress back. Hurry up!" He knelt down as near as he could do to Ursula without touching her. There was no sign of breathing. After a minute, Lottie came downstairs, dressed. "Is she dead?" "I don't know. We killed her," he said. "I killed her. Oh, this is bad. Awful. I don't know what to do, and we've got to explain what happened." She nodded. He said quickly, "You came to say goodbye. I arrived. I went into the front room to look on her papers. She suggested you looked at the pictures in the new lighting. You were on the gallery. I came out to talk to you when Ursula came into the hall and tripped and fell. Nothing we could do. Not near her. But I went home and came back. I've got to explain that." "Was there anyone at home?" "The kids were watching TV. Kids out." "You came back to give us the forwarding address which you'd forgotten. Don't forget. There may be questions as to how she fell. They'll want all the detail." "We're moving tomorrow. What shall I do?" Lottie said. Oh, someone will let you know. I think she's dead. Oh, God, I feel terrible. I do. Sit down. No, I can't. I must ring for an ambulance. A doctor. I'll ask them. He went out and telephoned. When he came back, Lottie was wandering round the hall. She couldn't keep still. They both looked down at Ursula lying on the floor, her stick suit slewed sideways. Joe was wondering what would happen next. If she was dead, and he thought she was dead, there would be a funeral, and he wondered who would organise it. And then there was the house, and who would clear it up, and he wasn't ready for it. And if she wasn't dead, what would she say if she got conscious? What would it mean for him and Evie? And he wanted Evie now, wanted to tell her, but didn't want to admit that he'd seen Lottie, and he'd shocked Ursula, let her fall down. Lottie said, "The loss of the development here was the last straw for us. Kit was going to offer it to the bank as another security, but you were all bloody frightened of Ursula. Kit thought you could have done more. Now look at her, it's too bloody late. I could do with a drink. We killed her, Lottie, you and I. We startled her, gave her a shock she couldn't cope. If you hadn't stripped, it would never have happened. Can't you see that? We did it. How long's the ambulance going to be?" "She could have fallen any time, Joe. Don't be idiotic." "They'll find out about the development. We wanted Ursula out. We made sure she died to get her out. We killed her because we couldn't get her to leave any other way. It'll look terrible." "Don't be stupid, Joe. I told you it's too late now. Kit's bust. No one will lend to him. The development died when you wrote. This is an accident. Get it into your head. An accident." Joe went and sat on the bottom of the staircase, head in his hands. "It's how I feel about it, that's the trouble," he murmured. "Part of me does want her dead. She was in the way, wasn't she? No one liked her. Actually, I didn't like her very much. But she was better than the family thought. Poor woman, now she might be dead. If she's cremated, I'll take the ashes on the district line. That's where she met Gus. One of her good memories." Lottie came and sat beside him and put her arm round him, laid her head against him. He didn't resist her, and they sat like that for several minutes. "Evie!" He had to ring her. He stood up sharply, pushing Lottie aside, and walked quickly into the morning room and phoned. Evie was on late shift at the shop. "Oh, something terrible has happened. Ursula's dropped down dead. At least we think so." "We?" "Yes, I'm sorry. Lottie was in here saying goodbye to Ursula. There was nothing I could do about that. They're bankrupt. They've got to leave the house tomorrow." He spoke quickly. "I can't think straight. Evie, it's awful. She's lying on the floor, cracked her head, and we're still waiting for the ambulance. I need you. Can you come out here? It feels like a disaster. She's dead. I'm sure she's dead. I couldn't stop her." What else would he have to tell Evie? Should he tell her everything? Evie couldn't leave the shift. She could come down later as soon as she could. She said, "Be steady, darling. It's a shock. Step at a time. There'll be a good explanation. Just manage it like you do things. If she's dead, we'll sort it out with Pa. Don't worry. Get her into hospital. She could have died at any time. Let me know where you are. And get that woman Lottie out of there." In the hall he found Lottie kneeling beside Ursula, leaning over her as far as she could without touching her. "She's not breathing, Joe. One eye's open, not moving." "Leave her alone, will you? Where's the bloody ambulance?" When the paramedics came, one of them knelt and felt Ursula's neck under the jawbone. "No pulse. 'Tis your gran, you say?" Mr. "A step-gran. She fell down and hit her head. Nothing we could do. It was sudden. She was standing talking, and she gasped, fell down. She couldn't walk very well." What happens next? We'll take her to the hospital and a doctor will confirm. But she's gone, I'm afraid. You'd better be there. And this lady? Joe said, she's the next door neighbour. Came in to say goodbye. She's moving house tomorrow. Do you both want to come in the ambulance? No, I'll come in the car. Mrs. Hadleywood needn't come. If there's an inquest, you'll have to give evidence. Did you see what happened, madam? She said, yes, it was awful. I can't believe it. 1 minute she was talking, next on the floor. And she started to cry. The ambulance men fetched a stretcher and began to lift Ursula onto it. As they were going out to the drive, Joe told Lottie to go back to her children. She was still crying. I can't believe this. She's dead and we're leaving, and I've lost you. And you're horrid to me. I don't know what to say, just as we're all packed up to go. Why did it have to be like this? With a cry, she went up to Joe as if to hit him, and then collapsed at his feet. Get up, he said, and roughly tried to pull her to her feet. Get up! She tried to climb and put her arms round his waist. He pushed her away. Lottie, pull yourself together and go and help your children. Please go. I can't stand any more of it. She got up slowly and went down into the corridor to the back door without saying anything. Joe watched her leave the house for the last time. He rang Evie again to tell her he was going to the hospital and that Ursula was dead and that Lottie had gone back to the house. He locked up quickly and went onto the drive where the ambulance was waiting. The ambulance doors were banged shut. The men got in the cab and drove away across the gravel drive and onto the road outside. Joe followed in his car. It was a small cortege. Ursula then, just like that. He might surreptitiously have thought about her death. But even so, he hadn't been prepared for the fact when it came. There, in front of him, crack on the floor.